The tiny silhouette raced through the churning waters, a mere speck against the looming shadows of Japanese battleships. Explosions erupted around the vessel, massive geysers of seawater cascading down upon its deck as enemy shells the size of automobiles screamed overhead. On the bridge of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland gripped the rail, his knuckles white as he stared into the face of certain destruction. It was 7:35 on the morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of the Philippine island of Samar. The acrid smell of cordite hung in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of fear that permeated the small destroyer escort. "We're making a torpedo run," Copeland announced over the ship's loudspeaker, his voice remarkably steady. "The outcome is doubtful, but we will do our duty." The words resonated through every compartment of the tiny warship, barely 300 feet long, as it charged toward Japanese cruisers 10 times its size. No one aboard the Samuel B. Roberts expected to survive the next hour. Yet they pressed forward, their single purpose clear: to protect the vulnerable escort carriers behind them, carrying thousands of American sailors. Through the smoke and chaos, Copeland directed his ship straight into the teeth of the most powerful surface fleet Japan had dispatched since the Battle of Midway. The tiny destroyer escort had no business taking on armored cruisers and battleships. It wasn't designed for this fight. With only 2 5-inch guns and a handful of torpedoes, the Samuel B. Roberts was built to hunt submarines, not to duel capital ships. Yet here it was, slicing through the waves at flank speed toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai, whose massive 8-inch guns could obliterate the American ship with a single salvo. No one in the 21st Armored Division knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite battlefield history, transforming what should have been an overwhelming Japanese victory into one of the most remarkable last stands in naval warfare. The destroyer escort that fought like a battleship was about to earn its place in history. Machinist Mate Vern Ryder grew up on a small dairy farm outside Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the third of 5 children. Born during the height of the Great Depression, he learned early the meaning of hard work and sacrifice. Each morning before school, he would help his father milk the cows and tend to the livestock. His mother, a former schoolteacher, insisted that her children receive a proper education despite the family's modest circumstances. Vern excelled in mathematics and showed a natural aptitude for mechanical work, often spending his free time repairing the farm's aging equipment. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Vern was 17 years old, a high school senior with plans to attend the State University on an academic scholarship. Like many young men of his generation, those plans would soon change. He listened to President Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech on the family's Philco radio, and within weeks had made up his mind to join the Navy as soon as he was eligible. "Ma, I need to do this," he told his mother as they sat at the kitchen table one winter evening. "I can't sit this one out while other fellows are doing the fighting." His mother wiped away a tear but nodded her understanding. The following spring, just days after his 18th birthday and high school graduation, Vern Ryder walked into the Naval Recruiting Office in Cedar Rapids and enlisted. His mechanical aptitude earned him a spot in the Navy's Machinist Training Program, where he learned the intricate workings of ship engines and propulsion systems. By early 1944, he found himself assigned to a brand-new John C. Butler-class destroyer escort, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, designated to 413. The ship was named after Coxswain Samuel Booker Roberts, Jr., a Navy Cross recipient who had sacrificed himself during the Guadalcanal campaign by steering his small landing craft into enemy fire to draw attention away from larger vessels evacuating Marines from a beach under heavy attack. It seemed fitting that a ship bearing the name of such a hero would itself be called upon to make a similar sacrifice. When Vern first reported aboard the Samuel B., Roberts at the Boston Naval Shipyard in April 1944, he was struck by how small the vessel appeared. At just 306 feet long with a complement of just under 200 sailors, the destroyer escort was dwarfed by the fleet carriers and battleships that formed the backbone of the U.S. Navy's offensive power in the Pacific. Destroyer escorts were essentially mass-produced warships built quickly and in large numbers to escort convoys and hunt submarines. They were never intended to engage major surface combatants. "Don't let her size fool you," Chief Petty Officer Dominic Cardarelli told Verna during his first tour of the engineering spaces. "This little lady can sprint to 24 knots when pushed, and she's nimble as a jackrabbit. In the right hands, she'll outmaneuver anything the Japanese throw at us." Verna quickly integrated into the ship's company, where he found himself among a crew primarily composed of reservists and fresh recruits like himself. Few aboard had any significant naval experience before the war. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, was a lawyer from Tacoma, Washington, who had been activated from the Naval Reserve after Pearl Harbor. Despite his civilian background, Copeland demonstrated a natural talent for leadership that earned him the respect of both officers and enlisted men. "The skipper knows his business," Cardarelli confided to Verne one evening as they performed maintenance on the ship's port engine. "He's not academy, but he's smart, and he cares about his men. That counts for more out here than knowing which fork to use at a formal dinner." During the Samuel B. Roberts's shakedown cruise off Bermuda in May and June of 1944, the crew worked tirelessly to master their vessel and forge themselves into a cohesive fighting unit. There were inevitable mistakes and mishaps as these civilian sailors learned their new profession, but with each passing day, their confidence grew. They didn't know then that they would soon be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The American strategy in the Pacific by mid-1944 had evolved from defensive actions in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor to an aggressive island-hopping campaign aimed at bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. Under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, Allied forces had gradually pushed westward across the Pacific, seizing key Japanese strongholds and establishing air and naval bases ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The Philippines represented a crucial strategic objective. The archipelago not only offered a staging ground for the eventual invasion of Japan, but also stood astride the sea lanes through which vital oil from the Dutch East Indies flowed to fuel the Japanese war machine. By October 1944, the liberation of the Philippines had begun with amphibious landings on the island of Leyte. To support these landings, an immense American naval armada had assembled, including the 7th Fleet under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid and the 3rd Fleet under Admiral William "Bull" Halsey. Among the vessels assigned to protect the vulnerable troop transports and supply ships were 18 small escort carriers divided into 3 task units, codenamed Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, after the naval phonetic alphabet designation for the letter T. The Samuel B. Roberts, having traversed the Panama Canal and conducted training exercises in the Hawaiian Islands, had joined Taffy 3 in late August 1944. Commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers: Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay, protected by the destroyers Hull, Heermann, and Johnston, and the destroyer escorts Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. Their mission was to provide air support for the troops ashore and to protect the invasion fleet from submarine attack. What none of them knew was that the Imperial Japanese Navy had developed a desperate and complex plan to destroy the American invasion force, designated Operation Shogo or Victory Operation. The Japanese strategy called for coordinated attacks by multiple naval forces converging on Leyte Gulf. The most powerful of these, the center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, included the super battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, with 9 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells weighing over 3,000 pounds, more than 25 miles. After surviving American submarine and air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th, Kurita's force, still formidable with 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, had appeared to retreat westward. This movement had prompted Admiral Halsey to take his powerful Third Fleet northward in pursuit of a Japanese carrier force, which was actually serving as a decoy to draw American forces away from Leyte Gulf. It was a strategic trap, and the Americans had taken the bait. During the night of October 24th, Kurita reversed course and led his force through the San Bernardino Strait, emerging into the Philippine Sea east of Samar in the early morning hours of October 25, 1944. Directly in his path lay Taffy 3, including the tiny Samuel B. Roberts, with its crew of fewer than 200 sailors. They were outnumbered 7-1. Dawn broke with an overcast sky and occasional rain squalls on that fateful October morning. At 5:45, the Samuel B. Roberts went to general quarters for the routine dawn alert. Most of the crew expected another day of providing anti-submarine protection for the escort carriers, whose aircraft would be supporting the ground troops on Leyte. Vern Ryder had just completed his night watch in the engine room and was grabbing a quick cup of coffee before heading to his bunk when the alarm sounded. The first indication of trouble came at 6:37, when lookouts on the Taffy 3 vessels spotted anti-aircraft fire on the northern horizon. Minutes later, the pagoda masts of Japanese warships appeared through a rain squall, silhouetted against the morning sky. Initial confusion reigned as American commanders struggled to identify the approaching force, which many believed must be friendly ships from Halsey's Third Fleet. The illusion was shattered at 7 o'clock when massive waterspouts erupted around the American vessels as Japanese shells began to fall. The distinct green dye marker of Japanese shells left no doubt this was an enemy force, and it was targeting Taffy 3. Rear Admiral Sprague immediately ordered his carriers to launch all available aircraft and make smoke to conceal their movements. The tiny escort vessels, including the Samuel B. Roberts, were ordered to lay a smokescreen between the Japanese fleet and the vulnerable carriers. Lieutenant Commander Copeland assessed the situation quickly. His ship, along with the other escorts, was all that stood between Kurita's powerful force and the lightly armored carriers. If the Japanese broke through, they would not only destroy Taffy 3, but would have a clear path to the invasion beaches where thousands of American troops were coming ashore with minimal naval protection. "This is going to be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected," Copeland told his crew over the ship's intercom. "We will do what damage we can." In the engine room, Vern Ryder and his fellow machinists understood what was being asked of them. The Samuel B. Roberts would need every ounce of speed she could muster. Chief Engineer Lieutenant Lucky Trowbridge made an unprecedented decision. He ordered all engine safety features bypassed, allowing the power plant to exceed its designed limits. The destroyer escort, rated for a maximum speed of 24 knots, would soon be pushing 28 knots through the churning seas. As the outnumbered American ships maneuvered to protect their carriers, Admiral Kurita made a critical error. Rather than maintaining a cohesive formation that could bring coordinated firepower to bear, he issued a general attack order that allowed his ships to operate independently. This resulted in a scattered approach that diluted the Japanese numerical advantage. At 7:35, Copeland saw an opportunity. The Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai had become separated from its supporting vessels. Despite being drastically outgunned, Copeland ordered the Samuel B. Roberts to make a torpedo run against the cruiser, closing to point-blank range to launch the ship's 3 torpedoes. "All hands, stand by for a torpedo attack," his voice echoed through the ship's compartments. "Smoke and evade after torpedoes are launched." The mathematics of victory were written in this single, desperate gambit. Under the cover of the smoke screen, the Samuel B. Roberts charged toward the Chokai, weaving through a hail of shell fire. Remarkably, most of the Japanese shells passed overhead, their gunners unable to depress their weapons sufficiently to target the small ship racing toward them. At 7:45, at a range of less than 5 miles, the Samuel B. Roberts launched its torpedoes at the Japanese cruiser, then executed a hard turn to retreat into the protective smoke. At least one torpedo struck home. A tremendous explosion rocked the Chokai, causing fires and flooding that would ultimately contribute to the cruiser's destruction. Cheers erupted on the Samuel B. Roberts as the crew witnessed their David versus Goliath success, but there was no time for celebration. The Japanese force was still advancing, and the battle was far from over. Rather than retreating to safety, Copeland made another bold decision. He turned the Samuel B. Roberts to engage the Japanese cruisers with his ship's 5-inch guns. It was like attacking a tank with a pistol, but every minute the destroyer escort could delay the enemy advance gave the carriers more time to escape and their aircraft more time to mount counterattacks. For the next hour, the Samuel B. Roberts fought with a ferocity that belied its size, maneuvering aggressively to bring its guns to bear while avoiding enemy fire. Gun Captain Paul Henry Carr, in charge of the aft 5-inch mount, directed his crew with remarkable efficiency. In 35 minutes of continuous firing, Carr's gun fired more than 300 rounds at the Japanese cruisers, nearly its entire ammunition allowance. The forward gun, under the direction of Gun Captain Clayton Schroeder, matched this impressive rate of fire. Werner Ryder and his fellow engineers worked frantically to maintain the overtaxed engines, which groaned under the strain of sustained high-speed maneuvering. The temperature in the engine spaces soared above 120 degrees as steam lines stretched to their limits. Men worked shirtless, their bodies drenched in sweat, knowing that any mechanical failure would leave the ship dead in the water and at the mercy of the Japanese guns. What they witnessed next would inspire them for decades, the Samuel B. Roberts was not alone in its valiant stand. The destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, along with the other destroyer escorts, were similarly engaged in desperate attacks against the Japanese force. Aircraft from the escort carriers, many armed only with machine guns and light bombs intended for ground support, repeatedly strafed and bombed the enemy ships. The combined effect of these attacks created confusion among the Japanese commanders, who began to believe they were facing a much larger American force than was actually present. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Sprague was maneuvering his carriers in evasive patterns, using the rain squalls for concealment while launching every available aircraft. Messages were sent urgently requesting assistance. But Halsey's Third Fleet was too far north to provide immediate support, and the battleships of the Seventh Fleet were engaged with another Japanese force in the Surigao Strait to the south. Despite the valiant resistance, the Japanese numerical and firepower advantages began to tell. At 8:40, the Samuel B. Roberts took its first major hit from an 8-inch shell that struck amidships, causing casualties and starting fires. The crew's damage control training came into play as they fought to contain the blazes and tend to the wounded while maintaining the ship's fighting ability. 2 minutes later, disaster struck. 3 more 8-inch shells slammed into the ship in rapid succession. One hit penetrated the after engine room, killing several men instantly and rupturing steam lines. Another struck near the aft gun mount, causing a powder charge to detonate prematurely. The explosion tore through the gun crew, killing or wounding most of them. Gunner's mate Paul Carr was mortally wounded, his body torn open from neck to groin, yet he was found still clutching an unfired shell, begging someone to load it into the breech. The third shell disabled the forward engine room, leaving the Samuel B. Roberts without propulsion. Dead in the water, the ship was now an easy target for the Japanese gunners. At 8:51, A battleship's 14-inch shell struck the port side, tearing a 40-foot hole in the hull. Seawater poured in faster than the pumps could handle, and the small ship began to list heavily. Lieutenant Commander Copeland, realizing his ship could no longer be saved, gave the order to abandon ship at 9 o'clock. The crew, many of them wounded, made their way topside and began lowering life rafts. The Japanese ships, now focused on pursuing the escort carriers, ceased fire on the crippled destroyer Escort as it wallowed in the swells. As Vern Ryder emerged from the engineering spaces, he was struck by the devastation above decks. Bodies of his shipmates lay scattered among the wreckage, and fires burned uncontrolled in several compartments. He helped wounded men reach the life rafts, working alongside officers and enlisted alike in the desperate effort to save as many as possible. At 9:18, approximately 90 minutes after entering combat, the USS Samuel B. Roberts slipped beneath the waves, taking 89 of her crew to their deaths. The survivors, many wounded and all covered in oil, found themselves adrift in the Philippine Sea with only a handful of life rafts and floater nets. Their ordeal was just beginning. This single act proved the battle was winnable, but at a terrible cost. The sacrifice of the Samuel B. Roberts and the other American ships had not been in vain. The ferocity of the American defense, combined with continuous air attacks, had caused Admiral Kurita to hesitate. At 9:20, just as the Samuel B. Roberts was sinking, Kurita ordered his force to regroup, concerned that he might be facing elements of Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, rather than just a small escort carrier group. By 9:30, after receiving reports of additional American forces approaching, which were actually false, Kurita made the fateful decision to withdraw. The center force turned northward and eventually retreated through the San Bernardino Strait, abandoning its mission to attack the American landing forces. It was an astonishing reversal. The most powerful Japanese naval force assembled since Midway had been turned back by a handful of small American warships and determined aviators. The cost had been high. In addition to the Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyers Johnston and Heel were sunk, along with the escort carrier Gambier Bay. Over 1,000 American sailors lost their lives, but they had saved the invasion force and secured a strategic American victory that would help pave the way for the liberation of the Philippines and ultimately the defeat of Japan. For the survivors of the Samuel B. Roberts, the battle's end brought no immediate relief. 120 men found themselves floating in shark-infested waters with limited supplies and no certainty of rescue. The wounded suffered terribly under the tropical sun, and all faced the constant threat of sharks attracted by blood in the water. Verne Ryder, though physically uninjured, watched helplessly as several of his shipmates succumbed to their wounds or were taken by sharks during the first night. The men clung to their rafts and floater nets, singing hymns and sharing what little fresh water they had, trying to maintain morale as the hours stretched into days. Some began to hallucinate from exposure and dehydration. Others simply slipped away during the night, their strength exhausted. It wasn't until October 27th, 50 hours after the sinking, that rescue finally came. A Navy patrol craft escorting landing craft infantry vessels spotted the survivors and initiated rescue operations. By then, another 25 men had died while awaiting rescue, bringing the final death toll to 114 out of a crew of just under 200. They had been fighting with rules that an enemy could afford to break. The surviving crew members of the Samuel B. Roberts were eventually transported to a hospital ship and then back to the United States for recovery and reassignment. Lieutenant Commander Copeland, who had survived the sinking and the harrowing wait for rescue, was awarded the Navy Cross for his extraordinary heroism. The ship itself received a Presidential Unit citation as part of Task Unit 77.4.3, recognizing its crucial role in what naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison would later call one of the most gallant actions in naval history. For Verne Ryder and the other survivors, the memory of their ship's final battle would remain vivid for the rest of their lives. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, waking in the night to the phantom sound of Japanese shells and the cries of wounded shipmates. Some found it difficult to speak about their experiences, while others felt compelled to ensure that the sacrifice of the Samuel B. Roberts would not be forgotten. After recovering from his ordeal, Verne returned to service aboard another destroyer escort for the remainder of the war. When peace came in August 1945, he returned to Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, and used the GI Bill to attend engineering school. He built a successful career designing agricultural machinery, helping to modernize the same kind of family farms he had grown up on. Though he rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, he maintained contact with his surviving shipmates through annual reunions of the Samuel B. Roberts Survivors Association. The story of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship gradually became a legendary example of American courage and determination. Naval officers studied the Battle off Samar as a textbook case of how superior tactics, leadership, and sheer fighting spirit could overcome overwhelming material disadvantages. The Samuel B. Roberts's charge against the Japanese cruisers became emblematic of the kind of audacious action that could change the course of a battle, and perhaps a war. In that moment, Verne Ryder understood they had to act beyond orders. In the aftermath of the war, as Americans sought to return to normal life and put the horrors of combat behind them, many veterans found themselves unsure how to process their experiences. The men of the Samuel B. Roberts were no exception. They had survived one of the most lopsided naval engagements in history, witnessing both extraordinary heroism and terrible loss. How does one reconcile such events with the mundane realities of civilian life? For some, like Verne Ryder, the answer lay in quiet productivity. Building things, creating rather than destroying, became a form of therapy. Others found solace in family life, in raising children who would never know the horrors of war. A few turned to alcohol or withdrew into isolation, unable to bridge the gap between their wartime experiences and post-war society. In 1954, on the 10th anniversary of the battle, several survivors gathered informally in Chicago to remember their ship and fallen comrades. What began as a small gathering eventually grew into a regular reunion as more survivors reconnected through word of mouth and newspaper notices. They shared photographs, swapped stories, and gradually began to process their shared trauma through the comfort of mutual understanding. The world moved on. The Cold War intensified, and new conflicts in Korea and Vietnam claimed another generation of American service members. But the veterans of the Samuel B. Roberts maintained their bonds, their numbers gradually diminishing as age and illness took their toll. In the 1980s, interest in World War II began to revive as historians and documentary filmmakers sought to capture the stories of aging veterans before they were lost forever. The greatest generation, as they would come to be known, had built the post-war world but had often remained silent about the sacrifices that made it possible. Now, with retirement, many found both the time and the emotional distance to begin speaking more openly about their wartime experiences. Verne Ryder, by then in his late 50s with grown children and grandchildren, was contacted by a naval historian researching the battle off Samar. At first reluctant, he eventually agreed to an interview. Speaking of the Samuel B. Roberts and its final battle proved unexpectedly cathartic. Details he had suppressed for decades came flooding back. The deafening roar of the 5-inch guns, the acrid smell of cordite, the faces of shipmates he had last seen on that October morning in 1944. "We were just doing our job," he told the historian, echoing the modest refrain of so many veterans. "We knew those carriers behind us had thousands of men aboard. What choice did we have?" Letters began to arrive from the families of those who hadn't survived. A woman in Oklahoma wrote to thank him for sharing details of her uncle's final hours as Gun Captain Paul Carr. Information the family had never received from the Navy's circumspect casualty notification. A man in California, born months after his father went down with the ship, sought to understand the battle that had made him an orphan. Verne responded to each letter, offering what comfort and closure he could. In 1984, the U.S. Navy commissioned a new guided missile frigate, the USS Copeland, named after the Samuel B. Roberts' final commanding officer. Another frigate, the USS Carr, honored the memory of gunner's mate Paul Henry Carr. And in 1986, a third Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate was commissioned as the USS Samuel B. Roberts, carrying forward the name and heritage of the valiant destroyer escort. At the commissioning ceremony for the new Samuel B. Roberts, several elderly men stood in places of honor on the pier, their chests adorned with ribbons faded by time. They were the last survivors of DE-413, now in their 60s and 70s, gathered to pass the torch to a new generation of sailors. Among them was Werner Ryder, who presented the ship's bell from the original vessel to the commanding officer of the new frigate. "Take good care of her," he said simply. "She bears a proud name." The scale of the crisis was about to become clear. Time continued its relentless march. The Cold War ended, and new threats emerged on the global stage. The new USS Samuel B. Roberts would itself earn a place in naval history when, in 1988, it struck an Iranian mine in the Persian Gulf, nearly sinking, but saved by the determined damage control efforts of its crew. The spirit of the original ship seemed to live on in its namesake. As the 50th anniversary of the battle off Samar approached in 1994, only a handful of the original Samuel B. Roberts crew remained. Age and illness had claimed most of the survivors. Those who remained were now in their 70s, their ranks thinning with each passing year. Yet their story had begun to reach a wider audience through books, documentaries, and naval history courses that highlighted the extraordinary courage displayed that October morning off Samar. At the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, a concourse in Alumni Hall was dedicated to Lieutenant Lloyd Garnett and his shipmates on the Samuel B. Roberts, commemorating the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. In San Diego, a granite memorial was erected at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, honoring the sailors of the Samuel B. Roberts, Johnston, and Hull who had given their lives in the battle. For the few remaining survivors, these memorials offered a measure of validation. Their sacrifice and that of their shipmates had not been forgotten. The legacy of the Samuel B. Roberts had been secured for future generations. Verne Ryder attended his final reunion in 2004, marking the 60th anniversary of the battle. Only 7 survivors remained, elderly men, leaning on canes and walkers, yet still standing proudly when the Navy hymn was played. They shared meals, reminisced about shipmates long gone, and marveled at how their brief time aboard a small warship had shaped the course of their lives. "I've lived 60 more years because of what those boys did," Verne told a reporter covering the reunion. "Not a day goes by that I don't think of them and wonder why I made it home when they didn't." In 2006, at the age of 80, Verne Ryder passed away peacefully in his sleep. His obituary mentioned his service aboard the USS Samuel B. Roberts and included the phrase that had become synonymous with the ship, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. At his funeral, a Navy honor guard presented the folded American flag to his widow with the solemn words, "On behalf of a grateful nation." By 2022, the last known survivor of the Samuel B. Roberts, Edred Lenoir, had passed away at the age of 98. The living memory of the battle had faded into history, preserved now only in archives, books, and the oral histories recorded by those who had been there. That same year, an exploration team led by Victor Vescovo discovered the wreck of the Samuel B. Roberts lying at a depth of 22,916 feet nearly 4.5 miles beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. It was the deepest shipwreck ever located, resting on the ocean floor with its hull broken in two but still recognizable as the valiant little ship that had charged the Japanese fleet 78 years earlier. Images from the remotely operated vehicle showed the aft gun mount where Paul Carr had died at his station, still trying to load one final shell. The bow section, crumpled from impact with the seabed, bore silent testimony to the violence of the ship's final moments. Yet even in its ruined state, the Samuel B. Roberts retained a dignity that spoke to its place in history. In that moment of discovery, the physical remains of the ship reconnected with its spiritual legacy, a tangible link to those 200 men who had sailed into battle against impossible odds on that October morning long ago. The Samuel B. Roberts was no longer just a story in naval history books. It was real, preserved in the timeless depths where it had made its final descent. In scale of sacrifice, few naval engagements can match the battle off Samar and the heroism of the Samuel B. Roberts. A tiny destroyer escort, never intended to face capital ships, had helped turn back the most powerful surface fleet Japan deployed during the Pacific War. In doing so, it saved thousands of lives aboard the escort carriers and protected the vulnerable invasion forces in Leyte Gulf. The decisions made by Lieutenant Commander Copeland and his crew in those desperate moments exemplified the finest traditions of naval service: courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to duty. When faced with overwhelming odds, they did not hesitate. When certain destruction loomed, they charged forward. When survival seemed impossible, they fought on regardless. In the complex calculus of war, such actions might seem irrational. The Samuel B. Roberts was, after all, just one small ship among thousands in the U.S. Navy's vast fleet. Its loss, viewed coldly, might be considered an acceptable sacrifice. Yet it was precisely this willingness to charge into the face of certain destruction that disrupted Japanese plans and contributed to an American victory that helped shorten the war and save countless lives. Naval warfare has changed dramatically since 1944. Today's ships are technological marvels equipped with sophisticated weapon systems and defenses undreamed of during World War II. The era of surface gun duels between capital ships has passed into history. Yet the fundamental qualities displayed by the crew of the Samuel B. Roberts remain as vital today as they were then: courage, initiative, sacrifice, and the moral clarity to act decisively when duty demands it. As the events of World War II recede further into history, the importance of preserving stories like that of the Samuel B. Roberts only grows. Each generation must learn anew the cost of freedom and the value of sacrifice. The destroyer escort that fought like a battleship offers a powerful example of how ordinary individuals, when united by common purpose and led with courage and clarity, can achieve extraordinary results against seemingly impossible odds. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? In the quiet waters off Samar today, no visible trace remains of the desperate battle fought there over 7 decades ago. The Samuel B. Roberts and its fellow ships rest in their deep ocean graves, visited only by the occasional research vessel with its probing lights and cameras. The men who sailed these vessels have now all passed into history as well, their first-hand accounts preserved only in archives and memoirs. Yet the legacy of their actions continues to influence naval strategy, leadership training, and our collective understanding of courage under fire. The battle off Samar is studied at naval academies around the world as an example of how superior tactics and fighting spirit can overcome material disadvantages. The Samuel B. Roberts specifically is cited as a case study in leadership, damage control, and the decisive impact of individual initiative in combat. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Samuel B. Roberts lies not in naval tactics or strategy, but in the moral example it provides. When faced with an overwhelming enemy force, Lieutenant Commander Copeland and his crew could have chosen to flee, to preserve their lives and their ship. No one would have faulted them for such a decision. Indeed, it would have been the rational choice. Instead, they chose to fight against impossible odds, knowing that their sacrifice might make the difference between victory and defeat in the larger battle. In an age often characterized by moral relativism and situational ethics, the clarity of their choice stands as a powerful counterexample. Some principles, duty, honor, sacrifice for others, transcend self-interest and personal survival. The men of the Samuel B. Roberts understood this intuitively and acted accordingly, leaving us a legacy of moral courage as valuable as their tactical achievements. As we reflect on their story, we might ask ourselves, how would we respond if faced with similar circumstances? Would we have the courage to charge into the face of certain destruction when duty demanded it? Would we risk everything to protect others, knowing that our sacrifice might go unrecognized or unappreciated? These are not comfortable questions, but they are important ones, forcing us to examine our own values and priorities. The Samuel B. Roberts reminds us that history is not merely a collection of dates and facts, but a rich tapestry of human choices, actions, and sacrifices. Each thread in that tapestry represents an individual life, with all its hopes, fears, and aspirations. Together, these threads create patterns of courage and sacrifice that continue to inspire and guide us long after the events themselves have passed into history. In honoring the memory of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, we honor not just a single ship or crew, but the enduring human capacity for courage, sacrifice, and moral clarity in the face of overwhelming odds. Their legacy lives on in every naval vessel that bears the name Samuel B. Roberts, in every academy where their story is taught, and in every heart moved by their example. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means.